leaving within a year. Joining me now to discuss foreign policy and a lot of other things, General James Mattis, former Secretary of Defense and author of Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead, a book on leadership and a lot more. Philosophy, the importance of reading, which as a former English literature major, I love to see. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's talk first about Afghanistan. And could this agreement be in jeopardy? With the Taliban now again attacking, it's the second attack in just 3 days. We've negotiated this deal with the Taliban. How can we trust them?
Well, it's a great question. How can we trust them, Andrea? I would just point out that this is a signature of the Taliban, though. This is a group that hates ballots and loves bullets and bombs. This is the way they do business. So the challenge for our diplomats in trying to end the violence that's gone on admittedly way too long in that country. Remember, that battlefield's also a humanitarian field. The challenge for those diplomats is enormous for our folks trying to find a way to end this.
And no question, it's our longest war, the multiple deployments. You know better than anyone the impact on our troops, on their families, back home, on the country. So what is the way out?
Well, the challenge we face, Andrea, is that terrorism is going to be an ambient threat. It is going to be out there, and we're going to have to work with allies, and we're going to have to work with like-minded nations, and sometimes even non-like-minded nations as we deal with this threat to innocent life. We're going to have to do that and accept that reality as much as we want to end that war.
Now, in your book, you talk about your frustrations with the Obama administration and President Obama and, frankly, the Vice President, Joe Biden, over decisions regarding Syria, the withdrawal decision as well. Well, not the withdrawal decision from Syria, but the red line decision. Iran, the decision not to retaliate against a threatened bomb attack right here in central, Washington, in Georgetown. Familiar restaurant against a Saudi diplomat. Iraq, the withdrawal that did take place, which you thought was precipitous. You wrote, in 2010, I argued strongly against pulling all our troops out of Iraq. In 2011, I urged retaliation against Iran for plotting to blow up a restaurant in our nation's capital. In 2012, I argued for retaining a small but capable contingent of troops in Afghanistan. You described leaving a region aflame and in disarray, and our friends are confused.
Yeah.
Aren't we at risk of making the same mistake if we withdraw from Afghanistan as the president has ordered by the end of what he says the first term?
We've been in what I would call a near strategy-free environment for a number of years, for probably 15, 20 years. So this is not a statement about one administration, one political party. It cuts across what it is we think is our role in the world, what it is we stand for, and just as importantly, what we will not stand for in this world. We're going to have to come up with a strategic focus, a historically informed approach to deal with these problems, because as we continue to deal with them in each immediate manifestation, we don't have a larger strategy guiding us. And we expect a lot of attention by young military sergeants and lieutenants on the battlefield when they go into harm's way, take their troops out there. We need to expect that same level of attention from our policymakers and our strategists when we enter into these kind of situations.
And certainly the suggestion of what we're experiencing now is that we're not getting that kind of attention. You write that history is compelling. Nations with allies thrive, those without wither. That was essentially the message in your resignation letter.
It was. It was. I'll give you the example, Andrea. When this town and New York were attacked on 9/11, within a couple months, I found myself in the Dust Bowl of Afghanistan fighting. And there on the ground, I was joined by troops from Canada and the United Kingdom, Norway and Germany, Jordan and Turkey, Australia, New Zealand. Now, none of their towns were attacked. They were there because our shared values were attacked. And nations that want to keep alive these experiments that you and I call democracies are going to have to band together and deal with these assaults on civilization.
Aren't our alliances now weaker than they were when you took office?
Well, I don't think I can quantify that.
But
well,
in the last 2.5 years,
they've been
we've seen our alliances weakened in NATO, certainly in Asia and in Europe.
You know, Andrea, if you take a look at current events, you can always see the tensions, because that's what grabs your attention, is the tensions in those alliances. However, right now you see a NATO that I think we're into the fourth straight year or fifth straight year of the nations, almost all of them, increasing their defense budget. So I could say quantitatively, NATO's actually stronger today. Now, there are political tensions. Those tensions have always been there in NATO, where the American presidents, I remember all the way back to President Clinton when I became aware of this issue, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, all saying the same thing President Trump is: you've got to pay more. The way I carried the message to NATO when I first went there as a Secretary of Defense was, I've sat in this room and you've heard this message before, but the American people are saying they will not care more about your children's future than you care. You've got to pay your fair share.
Well, in your resignation letter, returning to that, you clearly were making the message that you didn't want to abandon allies.
That's true.
The allies on the ground in Syria.
Yes.
The Brits were there. They were completely blindsided by that decision in December. I know that for a fact, as you know better than I do. But importantly, the troops that we were training on the ground, the Syrian Defense Forces. And now there's an Inspector General report, the most recent report. It's a devastating Pentagon independent Inspector General's report saying that ISIS is resurging in Syria, in Iraq. The president says that ISIS is 100% defeated. And now we see in Al-Hol, in that enormous refugee camp, the ISIS flag being raised. We don't even have the troops left to secure that refugee camp, where recruitment is underway.
Well, I think Secretary of State Pompeo has come out with a very clear statement about how we're looking at the threat, and it's characterized pretty much in the same terms you've just given. But you're absolutely right about the Syrian Democratic Forces. I mean, we have lost around a dozen troops killed fighting ISIS, we, the Americans in Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces have lost over 11,000 killed and 23,000 wounded. We are fighting this enemy by, with, and through allies. We've got to keep faith with those allies. You simply got to keep faith. You have to include them. Winston Churchill, I know it's hard. I understand it's hard. But Winston Churchill once said, the only thing harder than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. You've got to hold them close.
We've now got, our reporting is that 127 military projects that were supposed to be underway, and also including daycare centers. Daycare centers at Joint Base Andrews are having the money that was appropriated by Congress taken away to, quote, build the wall.
Yeah.
How is that appropriate? I mean, it's taking money away from military families, the people that whose service you know and admire and treasure.
Well, the military exists to defend the country. That's its primary mission. And what I learned, and I try to lay out in the book that I wrote for all the young people, whether they be military or political or business, or they're running a school district in their hometown, first spend time deciding on what the problem is. And it takes a while. Einstein was asked, how would you save the world if you had 1 hour? He said, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and save the world in 5 minutes. I think we spend too little time, even in this town, between the executive and legislative branch, agreeing on what is the problem we're trying to solve. And so when you come up with solutions, nobody agrees on the solution.
So aren't you creating a new problem when you spend money, billions of dollars, to build a wall that arguably isn't needed, to fulfill a campaign promise and take money away from daycare from military families?
Yeah, Andrea, having left the administration and laid out in writing and in straightforward manner with the president before I left that I was leaving on policy differences, I believe in an old French saying of devoir de reserve, a period of silence.
It, but I know you care about the troops and their families.
Well, we all care about the troops, and I think that's true about Republican Democrats. That's true about the White House and the executive and the legislative branch. But I think what we need to do in this case is recognize that trust, whenever you're in a leadership position, is the coin of the realm. And you build trust by talking with one another and coming up with beneficial solutions. And we've spent so long in this country dividing into different camps that it's almost as if we can't take a true crisis situation on the border. I mean, look at what the pictures on your network that come back from the border. But we've not agreed on how to solve it. It's as if we're always staying in this divide and conquer role of elections, I would call it, instead of the governing role. How are we going to solve these problems?
Well, let me talk about leadership. I want to share with you and remind you, it was so striking to me when I looked at that first cabinet meeting. Let's take a look at what happened when the president went around the room and was soliciting praise from his cabinet secretaries.
I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me and the leadership that you've shown.
Mr. President, thank you for the honor to serve the country. It's a great privilege you've given me.
I want to thank you for getting this country moving again and also working again.
On behalf of the entire senior staff around you, Mr. President, we thank you for the opportunity and the blessing that you've given us to serve your agenda.
Mr. President, it's an honor to represent the men and women of the Department of Defense, and we are grateful for the sacrifices our people are making.
You stood out, Mr. Secretary, because you spoke about the troops. Mm-hmm. And you stood out from that whole group of people who were all praising the great leader. Yeah. What was going through your mind that day?
Well, Andrea, the Defense Department, going back to George Washington's day, has always been an apolitical organization. It ranks highest in the American people's confidence as far as the institutions of government, institutions even beyond government. And I think a large part of that is that we stay true to the Constitution. And the Constitution has a way we elect a president. And Republican or Democrat, when they come in, I wanted to represent this national treasure we have that we call the U.S. military that stays obedient to the civilian leadership and civilian control. It is a godsend to us to have this defending our experiment in democracy. And so I wanted to just highlight that day. That's why I came back into government when I was asked. And that's all I was representing that day. There was nothing deeper to it than what you saw there.
Well, how did you feel, speaking again of leadership, how did you feel when your cabinet ally and colleague, Rex Tillerson, was fired on Twitter?
Well, I won't get into the political assessments.
Not political,
however,
just your human reaction.
Well, you know, Rex Tillerson is as patriotic and as competent and as committed and devoted American and public servant as there was anywhere. At the same time, we serve right on our commissions at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And I've now left two different times, once as a four-star officer and once as a secretary, under two different political parties, and I bear them no rancor. When you no longer serve at their pleasure, those words have to mean something, even when it's displeasure. And so it's just the way it is, and I don't take it personally, and I'm very confident the Secretary of State didn't take it personally. It was simply the Washington, D.C., business as usual.
Well, being fired on Twitter is not business as usual for a Secretary of State, but moving on to leadership and reading. You have an entire appendix devoted to your reading list, mm-hmm. and you write compellingly about when you were at the War College, and you really absorb the importance of reading. You write that reading doesn't give you all the answers, but it lights what is often a dark path ahead. Mm-hmm. Your personal library has thousands, maybe 7,000 books in it. What does it say about a chief executive who does not read? I'm just speaking hypothetically.
Andrea, I'm going to frustrate you here. I'm not going to comment.
I'm asking you about him. I'm asking you about the importance of reading for a CEO, for a chief executive, for a commander.
Well, I think that any time you have a leadership team, and that's what the president and his cabinet is, or in a corporation, it's a CEO on the board of directors, you have to have people with strengths and weaknesses. I know I'm not strong in all areas. One of the reasons I read is to buttress my weak areas, frankly. But you've done reviews of literature in your life, and you know the value to them. But not everyone has turned out the same as myself. And this is what worked for me. This is what I learned along the way. Plus, the Marine Corps, at every rank when you get promoted, gives you a new reading list. You know, sergeants get a reading list, majors get a reading list when they make major. Generals, when you make general, you're handed a new list of books you've got to go read. You're not considered
Maybe someone
complete.
Should give one to a commander-in-chief, and starting with call sign chaos. But I'll move on and ask you about whether you slow-walked some of the decisions.
No, that's always been a little bit of a irritant to me. The way I work for someone is I'm right up front with them. That's the way I do it. I had lunches most week with the president, just myself and him, or maybe the Secretary of State or the Chief of Staff. But I was always very upfront with him what I was doing. There was nothing that I was doing that he was not aware of. You know, the president's a straightforward person in terms of the way he comes out, and I'm pretty straightforward as well. So the lunches were very, very open.
Open and frank?
Very.
Climate change. When you went into government, to this office, you made a clear point about climate change, the danger, the national security threat to our bases, to our troops. Now, recently, since you've left, the Navy has rolled back an Obama-era climate commission, a task force on climate for the military. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've not read the details of what was happening and what was rolled back, so I don't want to comment on something I'm not privy to. However, I will say that climate change, I believe, is a reality. We are dealing with open waters and where it used to be ice fields that we have to deal with. And I think that let me just talk for a moment to those who are skeptical of climate change. Wouldn't you, even if you're skeptical of it, wouldn't you want to take out an insurance policy just in case it was right? I mean, I'm not going to talk to the people who believe in climate change right now, but for those who are adamant there's no climate change, you look at the receding sea ice and have different explanations. Why wouldn't we take out an insurance policy and do prudent steps to make certain the generation that's coming up is not going to be caught flat-footed by this? It's a national security issue because when people have to leave devastated areas and move elsewhere, the refugee flows, all the humanitarian effort that goes into it, the willingness of some people to take advantage of those people, terrorists in particular, and recruit from them because they feel a loss of hope. It's a reality we're going to have to deal with. And
just finally, you're taking some criticism because you're so critical of President Obama and his decisions, Joe Biden's decisions, that George W. Bush, in fact, in Iraq and elsewhere, that you are reluctant to deal with what is happening in this administration. Do you fear that you might be normalizing the decisions of this president because you were so critical of his predecessors?
Yeah, I don't think one person can normalize anything right now. I've got a lot of faith in the American people to draw their own conclusions. But remember that I signed the contract to write a book about military leadership in 2013. I was not the Secretary of Defense. I never aspired to be the Secretary of Defense. Joe Biden was not running for president, and it's a book written about policy and strategy. I don't, even in this book, get into political assessments of who the American people elected.
But now can't you speak more publicly about your assessments?
The U.S. military, since the time of George Washington, during Abraham Lincoln's time, has dealt with this. George Marshall, General Bradley said when generals retire their uniform, they should make sure they retire their tongue about politics. I stay with the military tradition all the way through, and the current political discussions are not something I want the U.S. military to be engaged with. And by the way, my predecessor, Secretary Carter, under the Obama administration, also steeled himself to say he would not engage in these same sorts of discussions. So this is a military, Department of Defense tradition that we maintain the military's apolitical role, obedient to the elected leadership. And the American people have good judgment. They will make the right decisions. I believe very strongly in our Constitution and our form of government.
It's a great privilege. James Mattis, retired general, former secretary, thank you very much. And the book is